Communication Untangled with Sookio.
Episode 4, Untangling Colour.
I read this book many years ago called Webs of Influence by Nathalie Nahai. It was all about the psychology of online persuasion and the techniques being used to make us click. One of the chapters that really stuck in my memory was on the use of colour. Nathalie explained how age, gender, the country we live in all affect how we respond to the different uses of colour, and I always thought this was fascinating. In this episode, she talks about the colours that imply trust and calmness and wealth, and how you can apply techniques of colour psychology to your own website and branding. We'll also take a break in the middle to explore why red is statistically shown to be a colour for winners. Great news for Manchester United fans, but not so much for Chelsea. Talking to me from her home in Barcelona, Nathalie told me when she first got interested in the way that colour shapes how we think and feel.
From the psychological perspective, it was when I first started researching the book Webs of Influence, which came out in 2012, and I started researching it the back end of 2010. But my interest in how colour and imagery can be used to affect some kind of emotional response in us goes way past that. Like from my childhood, I've always been an avid drawer and painter, and now in Barcelona I paint a lot. And there's a lot that you learn that is not written about in the psychological research about how things can move us in different ways. So, if you go and sit yourself down in front of a Rothko painting, depending on the one that you sit in front of, you might feel different things. Or if you go and see an exhibition of work by Van Gogh, part of the resonance of the work is the extraordinary way in which he used colours. And so we know for a fact in our own subjective daily lives that colour can really shape how we feel about things, whether it's you're feeling down and you wear some red, or you wear something more, yellow or bright to lift our moods, or you're feeling like you want to hide away or express a sense of power, maybe you go for black. Obviously, it's couched within a wider cultural context and subjective preference, but we know subjectively that colour really does have some kind of felt sense of impact on us, and that it also does the same for others.
So what are those things then that you see colour making us do? What do we do as a result of looking at that Rothko painting or seeing a different colour? What impact does it have on our behaviour?
So one of the trickiest things about colour psychology is that there are only a couple of colours that seem to be able, with a fair amount of accuracy, be able to elicit predictable results in the body and in the emotional state. So red and blue are the two most obvious colours to name. So if you look at the ways in which bright reds are generally quite arousing and activating to our physiological systems, we often use them within different cultural contexts to signify danger. It could be sexuality, attraction, passion, emotion. It's a very active, vibrant colour. It's also one of the reasons, I believe, that we use it so much, at least in Europe and in Western countries, for stop signs, because we register red as a colour which has got important information for us. In the same way, for instance, in nature, that black and yellow, when we see those together in snakes or in insects that might sting us, for instance, it signifies a sense of danger and wariness that we've kind of evolved to recognise. Hence why also you often find black and yellow used to signify danger on building sites, for instance. So there's a lot of subconscious evolutionary reasons why we might respond to certain colours in certain ways. The other colour, aside from red and the black-yellow combo, is sort of the kind of pale blues, which tend to elicit a more calming, reassuring, relaxing impact or effect on the individual. We also talk about, again, in Western cultures, blue as a feeling of sadness. So why are you feeling so blue, for instance, or down? We also historically have connoted blue with trust, security and wealth, which is why until fairly recently, a lot of traditional and legacy banks and financial institutions and even social media platforms, think Facebook and Twitter before, before the calamity of the last few years, these brands have all used blue to kind of connote the sense of trust and, you can rely on us kind of thing. So we can talk in broad sweeps about some of these colours, but others are a lot more nuanced and entirely subjective based on culture and individual preference.
And can we explore that a bit further about the cultural differences? So for me, in England, I might see red and react in a certain way, or yellow and black. And then what about, say, for example, China? So somewhere with a very different structure to the UK, different democracy, different way of life. So how much of this is cultural and how much of it is evolutionary, would you say?
When we're thinking about China, red is a very lucky colour. So obviously, if you're trying to reach a Chinese market, being mindful that it has certain symbolic connotations is going to be useful. Same thing with specific numbers. It's also true that, for instance, some folks in certain countries will associate the darker hues with luxury, for instance, or what some of the research that I found looked at ways in which colours work together. So, for instance, visual complexity and colourfulness of a website, or in terms of the kind of stuff that you have in your house, for instance, can vary based on gender. So women tend to go towards that which is more colourful, generally speaking. It's also been tracked with education. So in some cases, if you have a higher or longer educational level, you might prefer less colour. The interesting issue that we come up against now in particular is that beyond the cultural and potential gender variation that we find, you also then have generational differences. And this is something that you can really track if you look at advertising and marketing campaigns through the different generations. So, you know, from the sort of the pale pastels of the 50s and the 60s to the bright psychedelia of the 70s. Again, I'm referring mostly to Europe and to the West here. And then to the noughties, it kind of shifted again. We had millennial pink and acid green. And now with Gen Z, we're seeing a return to way more saturated, bright, almost acidic colours that if you've seen the most recent season of Sex Education, it's a perfect example of what this looks like for Gen Z. So there's also that element. And given that so many folks now are interacting on social platforms, that kind of homogenises what people in South Korea versus Japan versus Germany versus Kuwait. Like there's so many folks accessing one main platform that even in the light of hyper personalized feeds, there are general trends based on what generations are responding to that we can also say influences what we look out for in colour and what kind of colour most speaks to us. The difficulty is, the challenge I think is that we're trying to operate at a scale and speed at which technology operates. And colour is something which is so important to us. It can even change our behaviours. I remember reading a wonderful story, I think I wrote about this in the book, where there was I think it was rhesus monkeys, and the females exhibit behaviours where they go out and forage for berries, and the males don't exhibit these behaviours. And so a bunch of researchers, we can debate the ethics of this, but decided to look into the ways in which they perceived colour and found that the males were essentially colourblind when it comes to reds. And so they augmented the male rhesus monkeys so that they were then genetically able to perceive red. And upon that change having been effected, they then exhibited foraging behaviours like the females. And that's just through the use of colour. So suddenly they can actually see more of their surroundings, their behaviour changes, and then so does the culture in the group. So colour is massively important.
What other examples have you come across like that have really stuck with you?
Well, there is an interesting set of studies that look at the cones in the retinas of females versus males, and they found in human populations. And as far as I'm aware, this still holds, that there is a large minority of women who are tetrachromatic, which means that they have 4 types of cones in the retinas instead of 3, which means that they can see millions more hues of colours than people who only have 3 cones. And as far as I'm aware, in male populations, there is a larger number of people with colour blindness, which is, fewer colours perceptible to their human eye. And so while we might not say, okay, obviously in this day and age, women, many of us don't exhibit foraging behaviours in the same way, but we do respond to our environments in different ways. So for instance, if you go out and you have the opportunity to be in nature in spring, let's say in the UK somewhere, and there's just a cacophony of colours, and you're responding to these because you can see so much more than others might be able to see, your experience of awe and of beauty and of nature connection, which is associated with awe, is directly connected to the amount of colour that you can see and the vibrancy of the colour and the range of the colours. And so I'm curious, and it would be amazing to do a study on this, to see whether the amount of colour that we're able to perceive directly impacts our subjective experience of awe and beauty. And I'm also very mindful of the fact that for folks who can't see as many colours, I don't want to say that there's not that same potential. I'm sure there is. It's just, it might have a different flavour to it.
We'll come back to Nathalie shortly to hear her thoughts on using AI to develop colour palettes, and why our brains process a black and white caricature of Celine Dion more quickly than a colour photo of her. But first, if you're a Chelsea fan or you follow Italy, look away now. Because statistically, red has been shown to be worn more frequently by the winning team than any other colour. Analysis of men's football matches over a 55-year period showed that teams wearing red tended to win more often, and of course it's also the colour that the England men's team wore when they won the World Cup in 1966. And it's not just football. In the 2004 Olympic Games, researchers did a little experiment with competitors in boxing, taekwondo and Greco-Roman wrestling, randomly assigning them red or blue clothing. They found that 55% of the fights were won by somebody wearing red, but when it was closely fought, that figure went up to 65%. One line of thinking is that this is because red implies strength and dominance. It's the colour of blood, of danger, of love, sexuality and emotion. Maybe it just makes you feel more powerful and the competitor feels intimidated. It could even cut down on errors on the pitch because it's just a really highly saturated colour, so you can see your teammates more easily when passing the ball. Manchester United manager Sir Alex Ferguson seemed to think so. There was this one match in 1996 when they were losing to Southampton and he made them change from grey to red at half-time. Unfortunately, it wasn't enough to make a difference and they still lost 3-1, but it shows what an impact he believed it could make. As for me, I like red so much that I chose it as the brand colour for my company. But if I sat back and thought, well, this is going to do all the hard work of bringing in business without us doing anything else to stimulate sales, I'd be very much mistaken. Let's go back now to my conversation with Nathalie, where things have suddenly turned all black and white. Can I ask you about absence of colour? So, monochrome. My sister-in-law was telling me a couple of weeks ago that to help her cut back on how much she was looking at her phone and, doom scrolling and that kind of thing, she's got a setting that she uses to turn her phone to just grayscale. So it's just monochrome. And she showed it to me and instantly I thought, yeah, that doesn't look half so fun. And so I'm going to try that myself. How can this kind of absence of colour affect our behaviour, do you think?
So very interesting. So I was thinking about this with colour blindness in people and also fascinating research done with dogs. So dogs, for instance, see far fewer colours. I think it's actually kind of more of a sepia tone if we're going to translate it into the way that we see. And we know from research in the ways in which we process images that if you create a black and white image, which is obviously going to be of higher contrast, unless you're just working in the greys, we tend to track more on websites for areas of high contrast. So black and white means that there's higher contrast often between the extremes, because often when you're using colours, even though the saturation might be high, the contrast in terms of value, which is how dark or light it is, might be lower. So if you've got black and white, high contrast areas, that's going to really attract attention. And the other thing that's interesting, especially when you think about things like black and white photography, when we reduce the amount of information on an image of a face, so you make it black and white and then you reduce some of the complexity of the image, perhaps you make it into almost like a cartoon type face or a caricature, let's say, the brain processes that information much more rapidly. And so if you were to look at a full colour image of someone, let's say Celine Dion, and then you were to see a black and white caricature of her face, most of us would process and recognise the caricature that's in black and white faster than the full colour real life photograph. And so there's an interesting role there to using black and white, to making sure that you're using it in a way that you're eliciting the kind of response that you want, knowing that these sorts of dynamics will affect how that information is processed.
And we see it in big brands as well. So if you think about Chanel, Adidas, Nike, I think Balenciaga, all of these brands that are quite high end use black and white as well. I mean, why do I look at that and think, oh, that seems chic and high quality? Is that because of what they've done over the years? Or is it because there's something in me that sees that kind of monochrome stripped back feel as somehow higher quality? I don't know. Where does that come from?
Yeah, I mean, there is, again, this sort of more of a cultural perspective, but there is a connotation that many of us have in certainly in Western Europe with darker colours connoting sophistication. And I think there's also something about the and I'd be curious to read more about this, but this conservatism that comes with not showing off everything, to having something hidden, being perhaps demure. But of course, this is where, again, the generational, responding to generational trends then take some of these brands into different directions. A lot of these brands are having to adapt to the desires and appetites of younger audiences who have money to spend, but don't necessarily care so much about those historically cultural, pared back, conservative, not giving everything away types of effects that black, dark colours, pared back palettes would elicit. So we're seeing quite a big shift, especially in the last 3-4 years, in terms of how these historically traditional legacy-based brands are using a different strategy with more colours to reach into the hearts, minds and pockets of a younger audience.
For anybody listening to this thinking, this is all interesting, how can I apply it to what I'm doing? What are those ways that we can use colour to positively impact people on our website or people who we're hoping are going to buy our products? What kind of things can we suggest?
So something that I've really enjoyed playing with recently, you can upload images and then create a palette automatically through AI based on that image that you can then use across the breadth of your marketing material, across the breadth of your website. And so if I have an image or a suite of photographs that are beautiful, that show my products, say it's kind of like gorgeous earth tones and it's an autumnal season, and so we're wanting everything to be aligned with that across the website, you upload the image, the photograph that's got that palette that you want, and then automatically you can then extract the salient colours so you have a really coherent palette running through your site, from the call to action buttons to the headlines. And so that's a really interesting thing to look at. So I think the starting place I would suggest, if you're listening to this thinking, how do I even begin, is look at the photography that most appeals to you. Test it on your audience. You can split test it, different kind of photos with different types of, or the same photo with different kinds of palettes. And then based on the response that you get from the audience you're trying to reach, you can then use that as a starting point for a coherent palette across your marketing and your websites. And that's something that requires not only human ingenuity and a bit of patience and research, but then it's quite easy to optimize off the back of that. So as long as the kernel of the idea is good and you're taking good photos, then you can use AI to help optimize the rest of the process.
And previously that would have been quite a laborious task, using the colour picker tool and then working out the Pantone shade and getting that together. Another thing, just to expand upon something that you said earlier about the black and white contrast, making it really easy to read. And I think that is really important. And that's something that I see in website design a lot, that you might have maybe a very cluttered coloured background and yellow text on top. Whereas if you think about something like gov.uk and all of the websites that have been brought into being by government digital services, it's all about usability and all about readability. So if you're someone who has a website and it's got some really important information on it, for example, public sector, healthcare, you really want that high contrast, don't you? Because you need to make sure people can read it.
I think, legibility is really important. And I'm just thinking about the VAT sort of self-assessment part of the government website, which I used recently. They'll often highlight the section in yellow. So back to the point that we were talking about earlier, the black and yellow and white, that's something that helps people really focusing on the important information. And so thinking about accessibility and the fact that we tend to read much more slowly, or our comprehension for reading is much more laborious than our comprehension for images. And we tend to, especially now, if you go online, you don't want to be looking at reams of text. Something else that can be really good for accessibility, legibility, and I do this in emails if I'm sending a longer email, is to put in bold any of the keywords that I want people to focus on. Because a lot of us don't have the time to read everything from end to end. You know, if folks have, like some of my friends have dyslexia, some of them have ADHD. And so it's kind of, I know that when I send them messages, they appreciate it if I just really keep it succinct, because it's like, this is the most important stuff. And so really always thinking about what is going to be most important to your audience. How do they best want to receive their information? Are you making it possible for people with different needs, preferences, accessibility requirements to be able to digest what you're telling them with ease? And that's kind of back to this idea of, well, I haven't mentioned it yet on the podcast, but processing fluency, the ease with which you process information. So thinking about that and testing it on a variety of different folks is a really good way to make sure that you're being able to reach, you know, more people rather than fewer.
That reminds me of the story about Google and how they tested what colour to have the links to make them the most clickable. And I think they tested about 52 or more different shades of blue before eventually deciding, having looked at all of the data, that, yeah, that shade is the one that people are most likely to click. This is all going on behind the scenes without us realising. And what about, let's say that someone listening to this is thinking about launching a product, then what should they bear in mind in terms of how they use colour in their branding and their logo?
Well, so one thing that we didn't touch on, but which still, again, in terms of expectations, transmits a certain set of assumptions, let's say. If you're working in the more sustainable green space, and we use the word greenwashing for a reason, then obviously using earthier green colours is going to be helpful, because we do have connotations with those things with nature. Blue still elicits a greater sense of relaxation and calmness. So if that's something that you want to put across to your audience, that's good to know. I would suggest that actually the most important things to look at is how it's going to kind of be that combination between how your brand personality expresses itself, how do you want to be perceived, and also what's the generational pocket of the people that you're trying to reach out to. And one of the difficulties here is if you have a brand that has cross-sectional generations as their audience. So if you've got a brand that creates products that millennials and boomers and Gen Z all like, how can you create a logo that is, I don't want to say neutral enough, but that's not going to put off those different generational brackets?
Like a hotel brand or something like that, who they've got everybody staying. Yeah, that must be quite a challenge.
Exactly. And so then you might say, okay, well, one way to do that is to look at the general brand of the hotel, the logo, the site can be fairly neutral, but then the marketing messages that go out on TikTok versus Instagram versus LinkedIn, like whatever it is, those are then optimized for the audiences based on the generations that will be, you know, using those specific platforms. So it's finding that kind of intricate dance between that balance between the brand having its own personality and voice, and then the ways in which it creates content on various different platforms to better resonate with the intended audience without being at odds with the personality of the brand. And that does take a lot of creativity and human ingenuity to get that balance right.
Let's think about colour and how you can use it successfully when you're trying to appeal to different customers, readers, visitors, or any audience you might be trying to attract. We've got red, the colour of emotion, of danger, excitement; green, which implies nature, sustainability; blue for calm and peace, as well as wealth and trust; colour combinations like black and yellow for danger, or black and white for stripped-back sophistication. But what really stood out in what Nathalie was saying is that you need to think a little beyond this. What age is your audience, and what will their colour preferences be? Where are they in the world, and what content are they being influenced by, which might throw all of your assumptions right out of the window? And how can you divide things up if your audience is very mixed? You may need to compromise with your main logo, but then have a precise visual strategy for different social media platforms or magazines and billboards. I used to work at ITV, and I always thought that they did a really good job of their rebrand a few years ago. They had one main logo to represent the channel as a whole, but then different colour palettes for drama, entertainment and sport. It all felt really cohesive, but each was built for a different audience, and it gave you a slightly different feeling, even if you weren't quite aware of it. The key here, as with all good marketing and communications, is to experiment, test and refine. I hope you enjoyed Untangling Colour with me, Sookio, and my guest Nathalie Nahai. Editing and audio production comes from Rob Burney at Made by DBM, and we have all the show notes on my company website. Just head to sookio.com/podcast, sookio.com/podcast. And of course, please subscribe to Communication Untangled and give us a like, a 5-star rating or review. P.S. I don't mind a bit of colourful language.